This is the makeup recording for confirmation lesson number 6, the Old Testament, beginning with Genesis and Exodus. We'll start with our upcoming events. Our next meeting is Sunday, January 21st. As always, we meet at 6 p.m. See you there. This Saturday is bowling. It's bowling from 1 to 3 p.m. at Strikers. If it's Tuesday still, you can sign up, but if it's past that, it is too late to sign up. Middle school game night is Thursday, January 11th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. That's this Thursday. We meet in the coffee shop. The Frozen Chosen is a great opportunity for the kids' groups to serve, and many groups are planning on doing that. Make sure you have that on your calendar. It's Saturday, January 27th. The race begins at 10 a.m. And finally, we talked about this last time, one of the 6th grade girl groups is doing a breakout box, kind of an escape room church-wide for any students that want to come with their group individually. That is Friday, February 2nd at 7 p.m. Let's start with the memory work for this week. It comes from Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. It says, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring today." The blank there is firm. Alright, so we are going through the Old Testament. We just finished up the Gospels this year, so we are doing the Old Testament to start it off. And so let's do a little background on the Old Testament. It is made up of 39 books, and they are mostly written in Hebrew, and they are kind of split up into several sections. The first section is called the Torah. It is the Law and Moses. It's also called the Pentateuch. This means it's the first 5 books, and there are 5 of them there. Up next are the history books. That goes through Esther, and there are 12 books of those. Then there are poetry books like Psalms and Proverbs, and that's Job through Song of Songs. There's 5 of those. And finally, the Old Testament has prophecy books, and there are 17 of those. And if you're very quick at math, you'll see there are 39 total books there. That's the Old Testament. And that is the story leading up to Jesus' birth. Then the Gospels begin, as we have gone over so far this year. The New Testament is in the Gospels, and those are the first 4 books. And then the New Testament is everything that comes after Jesus. So there are 27 books there in the Old Testament, mostly written in Greek. And there are 66 total in the Bible. Those aren't super important numbers. Nate gave us a little trick to remember them. So if you look at the number of Old Testament books, 39, you can remember that. It's 3 times 9. That equals 27. Which is the New Testament, and when you put them together, it equals 66. So if you can remember one of those numbers in the formula, you should be good to go. And the word testament, so the New Testament, the Old Testament, that word means promise, covenant, contract. So it's the old promise and the new promise of God. And we see that Jesus comes to separate those, and He is part of the promise that we have today. So where does it come from? Who wrote the Bible? All Scripture is God-breathed, which means it's inspired by God, written by men. So God used man and men to write the Bible, but it is inspired by God. And this is important. It's important that the Bible comes from God. It's not a person who came up with everything that is in there, but God Himself. The Pentateuch, the 5 scrolls, the first 5 books, were written by Moses. These are the ones we're going to start on today. They were written by Moses, the first 5 books. So the next few weeks we'll talk about the Pentateuch, and we'll start off with that today. So we're starting off with Genesis, the first book in the Bible, and it naturally, fittingly, means the beginning. Genesis is all about the beginning of both the planet and how we know about God, the beginning of our faith, and the beginning of the promises that He has made for us. So Genesis means beginning. We're going to go real fast through these next few blanks, so you can pause this if you have any questions, you need to look something up. But we're going to go through what is in Genesis. It starts off with creation and Adam and Eve. The world was formed out of nothing. Humans were created in God's image. Then Adam and Eve ate the tree that they weren't supposed to, ate from the tree, and that was their first sin. And because we sin, we deserve death. So all of that is in the start of Genesis. I'm sure you read that story sometime in your life. If not, check it out. It's God creating the world and man, and we lived in the perfect garden, and then sin entered the world, and we know the results of that. The next story is the flood. Noah and the ark. All right, we all know that one. The people of the earth had become so evil that God wiped them out to start over with one man. When God looked at the people on earth, none of them were good people. There was no one that listened to him, that followed him, anything left besides Noah, so he sent the flood and started over. The next story that is a big one in the Bible is the Tower of Babel, or Babel. And this is the story where all the people got together and like, you know what? Let's go find this God guy. Let's go find the one that made us. So they decided to build this tower, and they were going to try and build it all the way to heaven. And I'm not sure that they physically would have succeeded, but God decided that he was going to put an end to that. And then he created language. So he divided the people up into many different nations by giving them different languages, and people spread out over the face of the entire planet at that time. So the Tower of Babel is where God made different languages. Then we get into the story of Abraham and God's people. We see the founding of the nation of Israel. So these next people are often called the patriarchs, which is a fancy word for father. So they are the fathers of our faith, of our religion today. So Abraham, he was the first one. God called Abraham and he said, I'm going to make you the father of all nations. I'm going to make your offspring great. I am going to choose you, and you are going to be my people. And circumcision began, and God tested Abraham a few times. He had to move across the country, and then he told him to sacrifice his only son. So God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but then asks for him to sacrifice his only son. And of course, if you know the story, Isaac wasn't sacrificed. An angel of the Lord stopped Abraham at the last minute, and they had a goat instead. Isaac was Abraham's son. The story of the nation of Israel continues through him. He had two sons, Jacob and Esau. They were twins, and they fought over the blessing. Jacob, the younger son, was smarter and more clever and tricked his brother Esau out of the blessing and inheritance. So the line of the nation of Israel went through Jacob, the younger of the two twins. So Jacob was next. He had two wives, Rachel and Leah, and together they had 12 sons, and these are the 12 brothers that form the nation of the tribes of Israel. So these 12 brothers are God's chosen people, and they go on to become the different tribes of Israel that we hear about throughout the Old Testament. Of those 12 sons, Joseph was the special one. He was his father's favorite. He was set apart. God gave him the ability to interpret dreams. And because he was the younger brother and the least favorite, his older brothers were jealous, and they punished him by selling him into slavery and telling their father that he was dead. And while he's in slavery in Egypt, he's exceptional well at everything he does. God blesses him. And then he's accused of having an inappropriate relationship with his boss, Potiphar's wife. That gets him thrown in jail. But later on, through his ability to interpret dreams and God blessing him in his work, he ends up being Pharaoh's second in command. So Joseph goes from prisoner in Egypt to second in command because God blessed him, gave him these abilities to interpret dreams and to just be smart and intelligent. And eventually, he brings his family to Egypt. So Jacob's 12 sons all end up in Egypt because there is a famine in the land, and Egypt has food. While in Egypt, the nation of Israel grew. It was growing at an incredible rate. They had work in Egypt. There was food there. But eventually, there were too many Israelites, as they would be known, in Egypt, and the people of Egypt got scared, and they enslaved. They captured and enslaved the Israelites, and the Israelites spent several hundred years in slavery working for the Egyptians. And then they cried to God. They said, God, help us. And that is when the book of Exodus begins. And the word Exodus means exit. And it's all about their exit from Egypt, their exit from slavery and being rescued by God. So the book starts off with deliverance. And God uses Moses. Moses is the one with the burning bush that eventually led the people out of slavery. So God sends Moses to talk to Pharaoh to get his people out. During the burning bush, God reveals his name to Moses, and he says, I am who I am, or the name I am, which in Hebrew, as you'll see on the screen, is YHWH, pronounced Yahweh. And this means that I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And this is God saying, don't worry about me. I am who I am. I am your creator. I am your God. And that was what the name gives us. You all should remember the 10 plagues in Egypt. This is how God freed his people from slavery. And you'll actually read this during your family time. You'll read Exodus chapters 7 through 11, and so you'll read all about these. But God sends 10 plagues to get Pharaoh to release his people from slavery. The 10th plague that you'll read about is the first Passover, and the Passover is the major holiday in Jewish and Israelite culture. And it's the story of where God sent the angel of death, and he passed over the house of the Israelites that had put the blood of lamb on their doorway, but the houses that did not have that, the angel of death went in and killed the firstborn son of every family that did not have. So the Egyptian families lost their firstborn. After they were released from slavery, the people wandered in the desert. The Israelites were looking for the promised land, but when they got there, they didn't trust that God was going to help them conquer the land. So after crossing the Red Sea and walking to the promised land across the wilderness, God punished them and made them wander through the desert for 40 long years. And that was because they didn't trust that God would help them conquer the promised land, the land of Canaan, where Israel is now. While they're out in the desert, God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai, and we actually spent an entire year of confirmation doing the 10 Commandments, so if you haven't done that yet, you will. But we still look at these as a set of rules that we should live by, and if you can follow these rules, then you're following God's plan and his laws set before us. After that, there is a massive number of the social laws that the Israelites had to follow, and these are laws that we no longer follow, such as dietary restrictions and how to dress and things like that. There were laws about everything, about death, injuries, property stealing, and daily life, but these are laws for our ancient Israelite culture, though they're not nearly as important as the 10 Commandments. The next story is the Ark and the symbols of worship. The Ark of the Covenant is the giant fancy box that had the big angels on top of them made out of gold, and it had kept the 10 Commandments, and it was said that the Spirit of the Lord dwelled in the above the Ark of the Covenant, and then they built a tabernacle, a giant tent church, where they worshipped to house the Ark of the Covenant, and it was God's home there among the people while they were wandering through the desert. And so our main point looking at Genesis and Exodus is that we should trust in God because he delivers. God delivered his people over and over again in the Old Testament, and he to this day will deliver us when we call on him. All right, we will see you in 2 weeks. There's reflection time as well as some family time. As we said, you're going to read Exodus 7 through 11. It is the story of the plagues. Make sure you leave plenty of time for that. Have a good one. See you guys next Sunday.